So we are not yet in Exodus. If you've been reading through the plan, then it's the end of this week, you're supposed to finish Genesis. But I'm ahead of you. So I'm going to introduce you to Exodus before you get there. And we'll talk. If you have any questions about Genesis, we can get my words forming right. Thank you. We can still talk about Genesis tonight. I might even ask you a question and explore something. And we can also introduce some of the themes of Exodus. And then next week, again, we'll talk about Exodus and spend some time on that. So there's a lot of really interesting themes in Exodus. And so I want to spend some time there. Before we do Q&A and whatnot, let's watch an introductory video to the first part of Exodus.
Let's talk about the book of Exodus. Now, you're probably familiar with this book because of the epic story of Moses leading Israel out of slavery from Egypt.
Yeah, but that's just the first half of the book. The second half has Moses giving the 10 Commandments to Israel, along with these blueprints for making a sacred tent. Now, right here in the middle is the story that connects these two halves together, and it all takes place at the foot of a famous mountain.
Okay, so let's start back at the beginning.
So the first thing we have to remember is we're continuing the story from Genesis.
Yeah, in Genesis, God promised Abraham that through his family, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And Genesis ends with Abraham's family down in Egypt. When Exodus begins, 400 years have passed, the family grows and becomes the people group now called Israel.
But there's this huge problem because the Israelites are enslaved to this king of the Egyptians, a guy called Pharaoh.
This guy is really bad news.
Yeah, horrible. He disregards their humanity. He brutally enslaves them. And he even orders that all of the Israelites' sons should be killed by throwing them into the Nile River. He wants to wipe these people out. The worst character in the Bible so far.
Here's where we meet an Israelite woman who wants to save her son.
And so she does throw him in the river, but safely in this little reed basket.
And Pharaoh's daughter finds this baby and takes him as her own.
This is the boy who grows up to become Moses, the man who will rescue Israel from slavery.
So Moses grows up, and one day, much later in his life, he has this crazy encounter with God where he comes across a bush that's on fire, but it isn't actually burning up.
And God speaks from the bush, and he appoints Moses as the man he will use to deliver Israel.
So Moses goes to Pharaoh to tell him this news that God wants his people free.
And Pharaoh, he just pretty much laughs at him. He was like, who's this guy, Yahweh? And in fact, he's so offended by this request, he decides to make the Israelites work even harder.
So discouraged, Moses goes back to God and says, listen, this plan's not going to work.
But God repeats his promise that he's going to rescue them. And in fact, it's right here, for the first time in the Bible, that we hear the word redemption. It literally just means to purchase a slave's freedom. But God here uses this word to describe what he's going to do for enslaved Israel.
And God knows Pharaoh is going to resist, so he sends 10 different plagues, one after another, like turning water into blood, sending all sorts of pests and disease. These plagues are really severe.
They are severe, but we need to understand that the story is presenting these as acts of divine justice against one of the worst oppressors in the story of the Bible. And they're all aimed at the purpose of rescuing these enslaved people and defeating the gods.
This all comes to a climax at the 10th plague, where God's going to kill the firstborn sons across all of Egypt. Every house. It's pretty rough.
It is, but it's also God's response for how Pharaoh killed the Israelite sons.
Now, as you turn the page, you suddenly get 2 long chapters of detailed instructions for what's essentially throwing a dinner party with a recipe for a lamb.
Yeah, but this lamb is super important. God tells the Israelites to pick it out and to prepare it to be eaten. And they're supposed to take its blood and then paint it all over the doorframe of their house. And anyone who is in that house will be spared from this final plague. And so this meal, which is called Passover, it commemorates this key moment in the story where God brings his justice on human evil, but also shows mercy by providing this substitute.
This final plague makes Pharaoh angry, and he demands that Israel gets out of Egypt, which is great. But suddenly, as they leave, Pharaoh changes his mind. He has a change of heart.
But on top of that, we're also told that God hardens Pharaoh's heart.
Why would God do that?
Well, what we need to remember is that over and over in the story, Pharaoh has already chosen to harden his own heart. So at this point, Pharaoh is not just evil, he's become monstrous. Even his own advisors think that he has gone way too far. And so how is God supposed to deal with such an extreme form of evil? And what we see in this story is that God uses his power to lure evil into its own destruction.
Pharaoh and his army are destroyed in the Red Sea as Israel passes into freedom.
And after this, we find the very first song of worship in the Bible, as people praise God for redeeming them. And it's in this story that the word salvation is also used for the first time, which means simply to be rescued from danger.
Now that they're saved, you would think that everything should be great, but the story quickly turns. The Israelites start wandering in the desert. They're tired, hungry, lost. And you start to wonder, what's God doing? What were they saved for?
And we learn the answer to that question in the very next story, which ties two parts of this whole book together.
Hi, this is Tim, and this is John. We think one of the best ways to understand the Bible is to look at the design and
Tim and John are fun, but you can watch them on their website if you want to go to thebibleproject.org. So Exodus, in Genesis, we find the history of a family, Abraham's family. But when you get to Exodus, Abraham's family has become a nation. And it's interesting because God promises in Genesis that he's going to give 400 years to Israel and Egypt. And Egypt, it becomes an incubator. And this family of 70, 75 people, depending on who you ask. And in Exodus, it says there were 70 people. In Acts, it says that there were 75. Acts was probably including Joseph's sons. He had 5 sons. So either way, 75 people turn into like 1 million in that 400-year time period. And they're in a fertile land and a country that's really accepting and wonderful until they get to a Pharaoh that's oppressive and significantly bad things happen. And so it's not 400 years of slavery, but it might have been 100 years of slavery, right? Because Moses is born in the thick of the worst time when the Pharaoh is having these babies thrown into the crocodiles because there's too many Israelites. And so it's this beginning of oppression and enslavement and infanticide that God is like, that's enough. Not gonna countenance that, not gonna allow that to happen. So you end up, of course, with the plagues and the deliverance, and they go into the wilderness, and there's Mount Sinai, and then ultimately they end up at the border of Canaan, and then they fail to follow through with that. They don't have faith. So that's the story from Genesis, or from the end of Genesis to the beginning of Leviticus. That the spread of the story is from Egypt to the border of Canaan. Exodus begins with an introduction of Moses, and of course you know the story of him going into the basket and Pharaoh's daughter. Do you know anything about that history, like whose Pharaoh's daughter might have been? Theologians think that Moses was likely in line to be the next Pharaoh. And when you look at where this is in history, something happens in the dynasty of the pharaohs. They begin to basically lose fertility because of intermarrying, their own family. And so by the time you get to Hatshepsut, my tongue isn't forming words today, so I think that's how you pronounce her name. But by the time you get to her, you've got a princess that can't have kids. And what happens is the father's, rather the throne isn't passed down from father to son. It's passed down from father to grandson if he doesn't have a son. And so the Hatshepsut, she would marry somebody and then have a son, and he would become the heir of the throne. But she marries somebody and they can't have kids. She's barren. And so he marries another wife, a concubine, and they have a son together, but he doesn't get the throne. Just because he's married the king's daughter doesn't mean he becomes the pharaoh. And so she basically takes over when her father dies and is just kind of holding the place of the throne until her son can take over. And in the time of Egypt, and this time in Egypt's history, if you adopted a son, they were treated as though they were born to you. And so she had the legal opportunity of adopting a son. And you get Moses floating up in the Nile River, and she calls him Moses, given by the river. That's kind of the name of that she gives this kid. And you kind of get the idea from the text that she sees it as somewhat of a miracle. And for 40 years, he's raised in the palace as though he's going to be the next pharaoh until he commits this crime that makes it so, like, you can't kill your own men. You're not even pharaoh yet. You can't kill your own men and stay faithful. It's like you've committed treason by killing the soldiers of the king. So he's not in a good legal situation, and in fear he runs, which shows a certain aspect of his character that's not that great. Ends up in the wilderness for 40 years, where he meets his wife, marries, and has a couple kids, and then God meets him at the bush, and he's like, "Oh, I'm afraid, and I don't speak well," and God's like, "Go," and he's like, "But go, but I'll send you your brother Aaron, but go. What's your name?" And he just keeps struggling. Finally, he says, "Okay." He goes back to Egypt. There's some interesting things that happen along the road back to Egypt, but then there's these plagues. And so Moses is this first great leader and hero of Israel. And he has this rocky beginning that God transforms into powerful leadership. The Bible talks about him as a meek man. Pharaoh is the other character that we see, and of course he's the king of Egypt. Now there's an interesting challenge or problem with the story. We don't really quite understand it, because in the time of Moses, when Israel would have been extricated and delivered from Egypt, Hatshepsut's stepson, her husband's concubine's son, would have been being trained, because we know this from history, he was being trained to become the pharaoh, even though he wouldn't have been the bloodline, like Moses is gone. And so he's being trained to be pharaoh, and he's off with about half the army of Egypt, doing some trading in Syria. And so he's not around. But you have the guy who was the pharaoh in Moses' day, who's still alive, Hatshepsut's dad. And he's there when Moses comes. So we're kind of thinking that that's the pieces, the historical pieces that are in place. And you have this pharaoh that throws the babies into the Nile. And it's this pharaoh that God brings judgments on. So the plagues that happened, the first one, they turned the water into blood, and you start to see this pattern. God is attacking the gods of Egypt. Happy, the god of the Nile, like he can't control the Nile. God's turned it to blood. Hekt, the god of frogs and fertility. Suddenly you get lots and lots of frogs, way too much fertility, and that's not good. And then Gab, the earth god, all the dust becomes lice, and it's like the earth itself has become a tormentor. And then the fourth plague of flies, Scarab, the god of eternal life, is attacked. It's like the beetles kind of thing, and now everything's a little beetle that's just making a mess of everything. Apis, the black bull god, well, the cattle get diseases and die. All these gods around in the pasture land die. And then the sixth plague is boils, and the priests can't serve while they're in this state of uncleanness, right? So every aspect of the religion of the Egyptians is attacked. And then you have the seventh plague of hail, and this attacks the rain gods, Isis and Osiris. And then Serapis, the locusts are thought to be protection, gods of protection, and they come and they eat everything that's in sight. And then Ra, the sun god, is attacked. Darkness comes on all of the land of Egypt. And finally, Pharaoh himself, his firstborn son, dies. So exactly what the piece of this story is, we're not completely certain. Like, how do you fit this into history? So we might be looking at a grandson or even a great grandson that's in the story. We're not exactly sure. The Bible doesn't give us an exact timeline, but the Hatshepsut story seems to fit in a lot of ways. So that may be where this story comes. All right. So the key verse is Exodus 12:12. On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. So, just a little introduction to the book of Exodus. Do you have any questions for me about either Genesis or Exodus? Let me rephrase that. What questions do you have for me? It's okay if you don't have any questions. I have questions for you if you don't. Yes, Patrick.
In Genesis 20,
Yeah.
God came to, I think it's Abimelech in a dream and told him, you are a dead man, for that woman you have taken is already married. And that confused me. And actually in my audio, it was more elaborate. So in my NLT, that's all it says is God came to him in the dream and said, you're a dead man for taking that woman who was already married. But in my audio version, it was much more elaborate. It was like God said, I will kill you and all of your descendants. And that kind of confused me because he slept with his wife, right? Or he was going to.
He was going to. He didn't
Yes,
quite.
he didn't quite.
So the background story is Abram has no.
Oh, in the line, yeah.
Is this Isaac?
Lied and said
No,
it
it's
was his
Abram.
sister.
Um,
Abram said it was his sister. Yeah.
This is the second time, right?
Because he was afraid.
Yeah, the king of Gerar.
Afraid.
So this isn't Pharaoh. This isn't in Egypt. This is in Gerar. He's again gone away from the land of Canaan to seek refuge where there's food and or something like this. And verse 1. Abraham journeyed toward the territory of Negeb and lived between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she's my sister, and Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to him in a dream and said, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. Now Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, Lord, will you kill an innocent people? And then, of course, he takes her back to Abraham and says, shame on you for not telling the truth.
But she really was his sister.
So
Correct.
yeah, so she is,
Father.
yeah, the father's daughter, so they're half siblings. Which this is not that far removed from the flood. So there's a theory that the genetics had not been corrupted as much. Now this is a fascinating thing. One thought, evolution kind of goes one way and says that we're getting better and better and better and better. Observation has told us that no, actually, like things are not as good in our genes as they used to be, right? And that's kind of the law of entropy. Things just kind of degrade and erode over time. And so that if God creates, he creates perfect, the DNA ends up being corrupted over time, and we have less and less quality of the DNA. And so right now, if you marry your sister and have children with her, it's probably not going to be healthy for your family. The children that you have are probably going to be there's too high of a likelihood of disease. So back in that day, not so much. So it's not until after Abraham, it's in fact in the time of Moses that he says, don't marry your sister or your cousin, or that really close. So that's sounds kind of weird to us today to marry a half sister. At that time, it wasn't that big of a deal. Anyway, you didn't ask that question, but that's fascinating. So the question is, why would God kill this man?
Yeah, or threaten his life, right? Yeah.
Adultery already, if he did that.
He had not committed adultery. He had simply taken her as though he would take her as his wife. So we're reading an ancient text without all the pieces. We don't see all the things that happen in this. It's not like we're watching a movie and we see every detail of their interaction. So we need to be careful about the assumptions that we make in this context. First of all, what would he hear when God speaks to him? God, the creator God that he has never known, Abraham's God, begins to talk to him. How many gods had he talked to this far, so far in his life? And how does God need to talk to him in order for him to grasp the severity of the thing that he's done? What's all the background of his life? We don't know any of those things. And so for God to bring this threat on his life, maybe the only way that he could have rattled his heart and allowed Sarah to go free. And in doing this, warning him this way, he saves his life. So in a way, you could say this is God being merciful. If you just recognize, I don't know all the background story here. God's not necessarily saying, this is who I am. You take one of my kids' wives for yourself and I'll kill you. That's not what he's saying. He's talking to a specific guy. Yeah.
And this is probably the opposite of Pharaoh. Because Pharaoh says, who is God that I obey him?
Yeah.
This one didn't know God either. And he could have rebelled, and said, who are you?
Yeah, he could have rebelled and said, who are you? I'm not going to pay attention to you. Yeah. And God brings a show of force. Yeah. In another situation, Isaac says the same thing about his wife, who is his cousin. And the guy who takes Rebecca, his family gets really sick. And he's like, oh no, what do I do? And he actually turns to Isaac's God and asks for help. And he gets this response. It's because you took Rebecca. And so he sends her back and they get better. But the threat to him is that if you don't give Rebecca back, then none of your family will be able to have children ever again. And to him, that's like, oh, I want to have descendants. Let's give Rebecca back. Right? So a little bit different communication, similar context. I think God's talking to the heart of the person. Yeah.
I was heartened and amazed at God's mercy because they kept messing up and lying, and God dealt with them the best to teach them. Whereas, the Bible didn't gloss over their mistakes and say, oh, these are wonderful. There were a lot of people, and yet God saved them and grew their character.
What does the mercy of God towards lying Abraham and lying Isaac say about us? Like, what is his mercy to them teach us about his relationship to us? Yeah.
No matter what you do, it doesn't matter. And he still forgive you.
Well, that's one way to look at it. Doesn't matter what you do, God will forgive you.
No, you say that
You ask for
no
it.
matter what you do, he is faithful.
And I think that's a fear that we have, that if we really admit how abundant God's grace is, like Paul says it this way, where sin abounds, grace abounds so much more. But if we're willing to admit that, aren't we saying that it doesn't matter what we do, that God will just forgive us?
Yeah.
Except they all suffered consequences.
Oh, they did. They all suffered consequences. It's true.
Well, and it says in the New Testament, you know, if God is so forgiving, then what's the point of being obedient? He says, God forbid, we are to be absolutely obedient.
Yeah. Just because grace abounds, does that mean that we should sin? No, God forbid. That's Paul's response.
Yeah.
Do you hear these wonderful children out here?
They're yours.
Isn't this great? If you need to speak louder to be heard, or you need me to speak louder to be heard, just let me know.
I've done everything in 10 years. I couldn't make that stop at present.
Okay, I've got a question from Genesis for you. Here we go. Why did God destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? Say that again. Okay, nobody left that's righteous, so what's the use? Beyond redemption. Okay, because he kind of brings their lives to an end, which gives the finality to the judgment of their life. Now, it's still the first death. They're not facing the second death in Sodom and Gomorrah, but still, once you've died, your choices are gone. And so God says, today is the day of salvation, not tomorrow, because who knows what tomorrow will bring. Jesus says it this way, don't worry about tomorrow, sufficient unto the day are the evils thereof. So today is the day of salvation, and if God brings their lives to an end, then their opportunity for salvation is at an end, right? There's an assumption of a finality. So yeah, they're not righteous, they're beyond redemption. There's an interesting New Testament story in Jude, where, not story, but an illustration. He says that Sodom and Gomorrah were an example of the fire of hell, of the judgment fire of God. And he's like, just like Sodom and Gomorrah, this will happen again for the wicked. One day, they will experience hellfire, right? Or the fire of God. And so this is kind of a cautionary tale.
Were they warned like Nineveh?
Were they warned like Nineveh? Let me ask you a question. We'll throw this back and see if you can explore this. Was there a righteous man in Sodom?
Right.
A couple of them.
Yeah, wasn't there the guy who his wife ended up turning back and became a pillar of salt?
Lot.
Lot, yes.
Wasn't they wrestling back and forth with, wasn't he wrestling back and forth with God? If there's only this many, well, if there's only
That was
this many-
Abraham, yeah. Now, how far away did Abraham live from the plains of the Jordan Valley? He was in the hills of Hebron. It wasn't that far away. He probably would have been able to see the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. We think that Sodom and Gomorrah were on the south side of the Dead Sea, which probably before this wasn't a Dead Sea. And when you look at some of the interesting things, there's evidence of what we would think of as volcanic activity without a volcano. And so the same kind of stuff coming down rather than coming up is kind of the picture that we get. So we think they were the south side. Right now it's covered by the Dead Sea. And he would have been, the hills of Hebron would have been kind of north and west of the Jordan. And so he would have been able to see into that valley and at a distance see this happen.
Isn't the Dead Sea where they were supposed to have been located?
Yeah.
It's over them.
Yeah, the Dead Sea is over them now.
So basically Nineveh was less rebellious.
In fact, Jesus said, if I had come to Nineveh, if I had come to Sodom and Gomorrah and done the miracles I've done in Tyre and Sidon, then they would have repented. And so it's going to be worse for Tyre and Sidon on Judgment Day than it was for Sodom and Gomorrah. That's what Jesus said. So take that for what it's worth. I'm not exactly sure how to apply that. But when you think about it, some people, they say, well, the problem with Sodom and Gomorrah was this kind of sin or that kind of sin. You've explored this, right? The Sodomites, right? Yeah. And Patriarchs and Prophets, page 157, Ellen White says something interesting about it. In Sodom, there was mirth and revelry, feasting and drunkenness. The vilest and most brutal passions were unrestrained. The people openly defied God and his law and delighted in deeds of violence. Though they had before them the example of the antediluvian world, the pre-flood world, wasn't that long before. Noah was alive during the time of Abraham. So he hadn't died yet. His sons were alive well past this. They actually had people alive that had lived before the flood during the time of Sodom and Gomorrah before this destruction happened. They had the example of the antediluvian world and knew how the wrath of God had been manifested in their destruction, yet they followed the same course of wickedness. I think this is an important thought. At the time of Sodom and Gomorrah, the kinds of wickedness that they had were very similar to the kinds of wickedness that were before the flood, that God said the thoughts of their hearts are only evil continually. But that kind of wickedness wasn't universal in the world. We kind of think when we get the picture of Abraham that he left a pagan culture, but we don't grasp that the Bible tells us that his dad started the journey. And Abraham gets the vision to go after his dad had already brought them to Haran. And his dad was on his way to Canaan, right? So dad got the call before Abram got the call. And there's more people that are followers of the God of heaven than just Abram at the time. And yes, there was paganism, but there was this syncretism, the mixture of the worship of God with the worship of false gods. And I think that you have this mix, a corruption of true worship, but a knowledge of true worship most places. Whereas Sodom and Gomorrah, they go all in on wickedness and violence and unrestrained passions that are so bad that if that's allowed to spread, then the whole world is going to be impacted in a very negative way. And so God puts a pause on the spread of that wickedness. Yeah. Yes.
I've often wondered, the lady that was turned to the pillar of salt.
Yeah.
I wonder why she wasn't given an opportunity to beg for mercy or whatever before it happened. I realized that God had told them not to look back.
Yeah.
I understand that, but God has told a lot of us not to look back either. And we've looked back.
Why doesn't he give her mercy when he gives us mercy? Well, let me ask you, if Sodom's destruction was a destruction of the wickedness so that the rest of the world could be prevented from becoming as wicked as that, when God brings an end to Lot's wife's life, do you think it might be for the same reason? Right? That the heart that she had was the same corruption.
Going back to the fact that she came out of this mess, she was part of this mess, and God said no, and she said yes, and that was it.
I have a couple thoughts about it. First of all, Lot. Should Lot have been in Sodom? Probably not. And secondly, should Lot have stuck around when the angel said, let's go? No, he should have taken immediate action. He should have grabbed his wife and ran out, and his kids and whatever, whoever was willing to go, he should have grabbed them and left. But he delayed and delayed and delayed until the angels physically grabbed their hands and dragged them out by force. So in this case, this woman was being saved by the mercy of God, not because her heart was interested in salvation. And so he drags her out, and they say, don't look back, go. And her heart's still there. And so she turns back to Sodom and Gomorrah and ends up becoming this pillar of salt, like a monument to the crime of and the wickedness of the city.
Right, and maybe it wasn't just a look, maybe it was actually the longing issue.
It's got to be the heart. It's not just the action.
Right.
Yeah, God's not punishing the act of looking. He's it's like not looking is a choice to be faithful and to believe God's promise of salvation. Looking is a choice to rebel and turn the heart back towards the wickedness. So I think that God had already given her mercy after mercy after mercy by the time she looks back. And looking back it wasn't the first thing, it was the last.
I would say that was for mercy, because the angel pulled them out.
Yeah.
I would say the only one who was deserved the salvation or the being away from the destruction from Sodom and Gomorrah was Lot only. Same thing with Noah, I would say. He was waiting when he made the last call, probably the last call was for his own family.
Yeah. The Bible calls him righteous Lot.
Upon him.
Yeah. The Bible calls him righteous Lot, and I always wonder about that. Like, where did his kids end up?
Yeah.
His wife, he's in Sodom. I don't know. It's kind of on the edge.
Because of him, that's why their family got God's mercy.
I think that's the key is God's mercy is so great, and he's so willing to save even a guy who's on the edge. And some of us would look and say, I don't know, not sure that he deserves that salvation thing. God's like, hey, any excuse I can to save somebody, I'm going to save them.
He wasn't too righteous because we got the rest of the story later on.
Well, I think that the whole episode of Sodom and Gomorrah and the leaving and the not wanting to leave is a great example of why God does not force us to obey.
Yeah.
Pastor, I do have,
Yes.
could you expand a little bit after Lot it came out and he went to Zoar with his daughters, and then he left Zoar and he went to the mountain.
Yes.
And then it's 1931. It says that the sisters are talking and they say, the older told the younger, our father is old, and there is no man left in the earth. I'm trying to translate from a Spanish one. That has descendants. So what does that mean? There is no more men on the earth.
Well, let's look at their circumstance. God tells them to go to Zoar, and Lot is fearful. Maybe God's going to destroy Zoar as well. Now, Zoar is a wicked place, and it was going to be destroyed. And he said, but can I go there? And God's like, okay, you go there and I won't destroy it. And he doesn't. But then he's like, well, maybe God will destroy this place too. And he flees to the mountains alone, apart from anybody. And when I think about the population of the earth back at that time, we're not very many generations away from the flood. We've got maybe hundreds of thousands of people, maybe 1 million or 2, I don't know, but spread out across the land, the space from where Ararat would have been all the way to the Jordan Valley. We don't have a ton of people. We're not talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of people and little farms everywhere. That's not the scenario we're looking at. So when he flees into the mountains and they're hiding in a cave, like it's days walk to where the next population is. So what they're not saying there are no men on the earth, because obviously you've got Abraham who has 300 men in his camp. And if they were a family of faith that was going to follow God, they probably should have gone and hung out with Abraham's family. But instead they isolate themselves. And then these 2 girls are like, there aren't any guys around. If we're going to have kids, we're getting to be old maids really soon here. And if we're going to have kids, we better start taking some action. And then, yeah,
But if they thought it was the right thing to do, they wouldn't have made him drunk.
Yeah, of course they made him drunk because they knew it was wrong.
I would say that that was, the example of, the condition of his family.
Yes.
Because I would say, well, the daughters performed that. Could you imagine the wife character?
Yeah, the character that's formed in the city of wickedness is not a godly character. And you find Lot's children end up, the descendants of Lot through his daughters end up being a persistently annoying, violent burden on Israel. Yeah. I mean, after they come out of Egypt and they're wandering around, and then once they're in Canaan, Lot's family are wicked, idolatrous, and they're always just biting at the heels of the Israelites. Yeah.
Well, this pillar of salt kind of thing, we don't know that she was exactly with Abraham. Maybe she had started back a distance. When I was
You mean Lot? Like she might have been hanging back? Okay.
She may have started back towards the city. Maybe she got too close, because when I was in Pompeii, there's pillars, people were totally, from the intenseness of the volcanic ash and all that.
Fascinating thought.
They just,
I'm just going to repeat that. So
no, but you could see that there was the forms of people that were just instantly covered with ash and they became pillars, okay? So maybe she wasn't, we always envisioned that she was holding Abraham's hand and the angel, but maybe she started back towards the city and maybe she got too close.
So let me repeat that for the people on Zoom so they can hear. The suggestion is that maybe Lot's wife didn't just like turn around a little bit over her shoulder and look at the city, but that she maybe wasn't standing right beside him. Maybe she turned back, and like Pompeii and that experience, people would, I don't know what the word is, but they turned into mineralized forms, and maybe that's what happened to her.
I don't know.
Certainly that's something that God uses natural things to accomplish his will. He could have done that.
And there is a comment in the Patriarchs and Prophets about Lot and his wife. And she mentions that, I think it was chapter 13 of Patriarchs and Prophets, that she says that if Lot wouldn't be hesitant to get out, that she would have been safe. She would have been safe. She would not have turned around and turned into salt.
And you think about the wealth that was there. This is something that Ellen White talks a bit about as well. And in the book of Jude mentions it as well. In a situation where there's great wealth, there's opportunity for leisure. And without structure and morality, leisure turns into unrestrained pleasure seeking, hedonism. It turns into violence because of greed and the desire for more wealth, and simply because of the awful things, in order to get your way, you attack other people. So there's violence and hedonism. And when you think of the ease of an environment, a city where things are easy to get, and you have wealth and leisure, it's not a nice idea to give all of that up and go to a place where you have no possessions, you have no wealth, and it's not as easy. Living in the country, with Abraham, not a fun idea. So Lot's wife turning back, certainly the wickedness is there, but the longing is, I'd much rather have the pleasures of leisure and wealth than what God is offering, which is something we need to be thoughtful of too. Yeah.
Another thing, probably regarding to that comment, it's, I don't know how you will see this, that the Bible says that God is love, right?
Yes.
And let's say on my reading of my Bible, I have found out that how big, humongous his love for me,
Yeah.
for you, and for all his humanity. And, this is the one that I think, I don't know if you give it a thought. It's, in the day of the Lord, God will come to destroy, not you and me or the wicked. He's gonna come to destroy sin.
Mhm.
And all of those who are hanging on to it, they're gonna be destroyed.
Let me restate that. Just the idea that God's great love is amazing. When the time comes that he brings destruction, his goal isn't to destroy people, but to destroy sin. But all those who cling to that sin will be destroyed with it. Yeah. And I think it's also worth pointing out, when God offered Lot and his wife and his family salvation, it was very similar to what Jesus did when he offers us salvation. He comes and gives his life on the cross. He gives us an offer of salvation. And we get a choice. Are we going to face God and his gift and accept it? Or are we going to turn away like Lot's wife did? She turned back to the pleasures of sin in the world, and we get to do that if we want to as well. But the consequences are we cling to our sin, and ultimately when judgment comes, we'll be destroyed with it. But if we simply turn towards Jesus and let him save us, then we won't be destroyed with sin, but sin will be consumed and will be made righteous by his righteousness. That's an illustration I think the Bible is wanting us to pay attention to. Well, Jan, would you
Yes.
lead us in prayer?